I'm Steve Herzenberg. I'm an economist and the executive director of the Keystone Research Center, which houses the Pennsylvania Budget and Policy Center. We're delighted to have folks with us today for a really important workshop around infrastructure. That is the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, also known as the Bipartisan Infrastructure Plan. What we're going to be talking about today is the opportunities to use those federal resources to address really critical issues in Pennsylvania, creating jobs, including good union jobs, addressing climate issues, repairing the damage from a century or more of extraction, and improving quality of life. We're still waiting for one of our panelists, Representative Leanne Kruger. So she was scheduled to go first, but she's still trying to get into the meeting. So we're going to juggle things a little bit. The basic structure of this workshop is pretty simple. Leanne will talk kind of broadly whenever she gets here about the overall infrastructure package, the $555 billion in new money, in addition to renewed funding for a wide range of programs that brings the total to 1.2 trillion. And it's a lot of different money for traditional infrastructure, for repairing the damage from extraction, for manufacturing in some cases. So addresses for sustainable transportation and electric vehicle infrastructure. So it's got a lot of different components that are really important to the future of Pennsylvania. Again, everyone knows that traditional infrastructure, whether it's roads with potholes or bridges that are at risk of collapsing, or as we discovered recently in Pittsburgh, can actually collapse, but also addressing some of the other issues related to the environment, related to climate. And so so Leanne's going to talk more about the sort of big picture and the plans that she and other legislators and blue-green stakeholders in Pennsylvania have for working together over the next year to so-called win the win, to use this money well in Pennsylvania. And Leanne, you seem to be here. So you're on mute now.
I am here. Sorry, I had a hard time getting in today. I apologize, folks.
If it makes you feel any better, so did I. So then what, Leanne, we're going to go to you first to provide the overview. I provide a bit of a basic introduction, but Representative Leanne Kruger is a really...
Steve, I think we just lost her.
We lost her again?
Oh, she's back. She's coming back. Here she is.
Leanne, are you still there? Connecting to audio? Leanne, can you hear me?
I had to, yep, she should be able to unmute in just a second. I have to make her a co-host so she can do so.
Gotcha. We're waiting with bated breath here. Okay, okay.
You're back. There we
go. Okay.
Gosh, folks, I so apologize. The technology has been challenging today.
Second time's a charm. So Leanne, you should tell people a little bit about, you're a leader, a young and visionary leader in the legislature, and particularly a leader on blue-green issues, both with respect to a blue-green caucus that has recently sprung back to life and is growing in the legislature. And actually also Leanne is leading a blue-green kind of stakeholder group that includes her and some other legislators, includes some environmentalists, includes some folks from labor, and includes Keystone Research Center and me, and includes Susan Gabreski. So Leanne, take it away and let people know about the infrastructure plan and your thoughts around how we win the win and maximize the benefits from these federal resources.
Sure. Thank you, Steve, for your kind words. I am not as young as I used to be. I've been in the legislature for 7 years now. I represent the 161st district in Delaware County, which is the seat that I flipped from red to blue in a special election back in 15, and I believe in systems change. So I'm someone who ran for office because I believe that having the ability to influence a $40+ billion state budget would get to greater change on the issues that I cared about than the work that I was doing before this in the nonprofit sector. So that's how I got to where I'm at now. And for the entire term that I've served in the legislature, I've served on both the Labor Committee as the secretary on the Democratic side and on the Environmental Resources and Energy Committee. And these are two spaces that have been very polarized, not just in Harrisburg, but on the national level. I happen to believe that there are forces that are intentionally trying to drive folks apart and are using a lot of resources to do that. But at the end of the day, I found as a member in the legislature, I'd go to a labor committee hearing and we'd be fighting to protect things like organizing rights and collective bargaining and safe workplaces and the right to a fair wage. And then I would go to the environmental committee and we'd be fighting to
Don't tell me we're having internet connectivity issues now.
So this is why we need broadband.
Exactly.
Yeah.
in the labor movement, in the environmental movement. Am I
You're
still
back.
here?
Yeah,
Okay.
you're
Sorry, my computer screen is flashing for some reason. I asked if anyone had ever tried to bring them together before, and they said no. And so I've been working to forge connections between these two, both groups of legislators and also groups of leaders since that time. I think we have tremendous opportunity. Steve's going to talk about the Federal Infrastructure Act, and there's literally millions and millions and millions of dollars coming to Pennsylvania. And if we can find common ground in places where we can invest in jobs that will clean up the environment, protect our air and water, protect our energy future, and also create good paying jobs for Pennsylvanians at the same time, then I think we're really doing important work. So there's a group of environmental and labor leaders that I've been convening for the past 2 years who recently met with the Wolf administration, with our governor's office, to talk about all of the money that's coming in and to talk about putting labor standards in place. The Biden administration, through executive order, has put a project labor agreement standard in place for projects over 35 million, but some of these projects might be smaller. And so we talked about opportunities to expand project labor agreements. We talked about tracking of contractors, because here in Pennsylvania, as in many places, there are contractors who are able to bid on and get government contracts who are known to be bad actors, both in how they treat their employees and through sometimes things like wage theft or paying people under the table, but also companies that will come in with a bid for a low price and then through constant change orders actually drive up the price of the project to much higher than it would have been in the first place with a different contractor. So we're having a lot of conversations about responsible contracting ordinances and whether that's something that could actually be done at the state level without going through the legislature, because right now the Labor Committee is controlled by someone who is not amenable to running legislation that actually expands protections to good jobs. He's basically in the pocket of the big business groups who want to diminish the rights of working people any way that they can. So that's what we're up against in Harrisburg right now. But I am hopeful, because I have seen that there are folks in the labor movement who can talk about clean water and can talk about environmental justice and understand that if their members are going into unsafe spaces, they're getting the same health impacts by breathing in bad chemicals or being exposed to things that they're going to take back to their families, and they want their workers to be safe. And I've also, heard folks in the environmental movement talk about the importance of safe working standards for folks in the labor movement, and that if work is done by people who've been through a qualified apprenticeship program, the work's going to be done better and it's going to be safer for everybody at the end of the day, the workers on the job and also the neighbors who live within a reaching distance of that job site. So I will tell you, there's certainly been challenges. We've already faced a number of challenges along the way where folks were on an opposite side of an issue, but I fundamentally believe that there is common ground in this space, and that by building relationship and creating communications so that when there's an issue a person on one side of the issue can actually call someone on the other side of the issue and have a conversation about it, a direct conversation about it, instead of the game of telephone through multiple lobbyists that often happens in the state capitol. I believe that we can also find solutions much quicker that way as well. So, Steve's going to talk about the money coming in, but I do see tremendous opportunity here. And I am hopeful enough to see that I think that this is just the starting point, that we can continue to work together to really have some true economic impact and jobs impact and positive environmental impact in Pennsylvania. I'm tired of fighting bad bills, both in the Labor Committee and the Environmental Committee. When a hearing is called, it's usually, what is the bad thing that we are fighting today? What is the thing that we're going to try to fiercely fight on that House floor that hopefully the governor will veto? And it's sort of political theater. And I am hopeful to serve in the legislature at a time when we can actually get good bills done instead of fighting bad ones all the time. So Steve, I'm going to stop there because I know I was a little late getting on because of technology, but I can stay on for the whole session, and I'm happy to answer questions later on when we get to that spot in the agenda.
That's great, Leanne. Thank you so much. So now we're going to drill down in a couple different areas, and these presentations are going to be both, really important opportunities in and of themselves, but they're also going to illustrate kind of a process and kind of a coalition and policy and advocacy process that we think should be pursued really in as many of the different pots of funding in the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act as possible. So the first presentation to kind of make all this general discussion of infrastructure and creating good union jobs while addressing environmental challenges. The first person who's going to make that really concrete for you is Eric Dixon from the Ohio River Valley Institute. He's a wonderful, gifted researcher in terms of supporting coalitions and practical advocacy. He's going to talk to you about abandoned mine lands, and take it away, Eric. You're on mute.
Thanks so much, Steve. Well, first I want to thank you for having me and thank your organization for putting on this conference. I think it's really timely, especially with the infrastructure bill. And I want to thank Representative Kruger for, all the work that you're doing to convene those coalitions. I'm going to be talking in particular about one of the programs that's coming through the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, or the IIJA, as my presentation will kind of refer to throughout. And I'm going to go ahead and share my slides now. So the first question is that I think many of us ask when it comes to a program that we're looking at under the new bill is, how much money is coming to our state in particular? The overall, nationally, the abandoned mine cleanup program under the bipartisan infrastructure bill will invest about $12 billion over 15 years. 70% of that is going to come to the Ohio River Valley, and 34% of the total, so more than a third, is coming to Pennsylvania. And that's about $3.7 billion. So that's a $3.7 billion boost to an existing program. This is not a new program. It's been in place since 1977. And I'll talk more about the agency that administers the program within the Commonwealth later on in the presentation. But in contrast to, for example, the well plugging program, that's new. The mine cleanup program, it's been in existence. This is a boost and has some changes to how it'll be implemented. So this gives you a sense of really how historic this level of investment is for abandoned mine cleanup. The slice of the pie in the top right, the kind of dark orange, that's how much we've cleaned up in terms of abandoned mines over the past 44 years since the program was created. The bottom slice is how much we will clean up just in the next 15 years with the investment from the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. So you'll see we're going to clean up more in the next 15 than we have already throughout the entirety of the program. But it's important to note that we're still going to have a lot of problems remaining after 15 years pass. And that's the slice of the pie on the left, the kind of light yellow one. And that's important because it means that state agencies are going to have to make, despite funding increases, they're still going to have to make hard decisions about which problems to clean up and which problems to wait to clean up until a later date. This gives you a sense of how large the increase in funds is in Pennsylvania in particular. This is just for abandoned mine cleanup funding. It's a 469% year-over-year increase in mine cleanup funding. And Pennsylvania will get the most of any of the states, like I said at the beginning. There are a few different pots of money. Can talk more about that in the questions, but what you should know is that this money in general, like the funds under the IIJI, it's not like general economic development funding. This has to be used for the reclamation of land and water damaged by coal mining. So it has a pretty strict requirement for that. Next, I'm going to kind of quickly click through some slides to give you a sense of what these projects actually look like. There are a number of types of projects that fall under the broad category of mine cleanup, and it's any land and water damaged by the coal industry prior to 1977. So here is a pile of coal waste or gob that was reclaimed by the Mine Cleanup Agency in Pennsylvania a few years ago. This is what it looks like afterwards. Here's another similar project where you can see the coal waste pile on the left and the kind of after photo on the right. This is the Erenfeld Project, which has gotten a lot of press because it's been one of the largest projects that the AML agency has ever done in Pennsylvania. But it's not just large piles of coal waste. It's also processing facilities that are abandoned. Or mine openings that have never been closed up. Here's another before and after on a surface mine reclamation project. Here are some kind of deering photos. Here's a photo of a mine portal. There are a lot of these across Pennsylvania and across the country. It's not just these large surface mines. It's also underground mining features that have never been, made safe or reclaimed. And it's a lot of water pollution, including miles, probably tens of thousands of miles of acid mine drainage impacted streams in Pennsylvania. And the acid mine drainage is what you see when you see these orange running streams, which is probably more of a problem in Pennsylvania than any other state. And it's also mine fires, which are, some mine fires are kind of perennially burning underground and on the surface, and they're extremely expensive to put out and reclaim, which is why some of them have continued to burn. But hopefully this new funding allows the agency to get at some of those problems. And it's also landslides from small to large that can be above people's homes like this, and literally threatening to tear down their homes. So some of these problems are more common in other states. In Pennsylvania, the most common problems are water problems, kind of landslides and high walls, as well as coal waste. And the agency that cleans up these problems is within the Department of Environmental Protection. It's the Bureau of Abandoned Mine Reclamation. So like I said, this agency has been around for a long time. And they have in my opinion, one of the best programs in the country in terms of abandoned mine reclamation. So the process that they utilize to reclaim these sites, at least historically, kind of goes like this. The federal government holds the money. They send the grant to this agency within the DEP. And that agency, the Bureau of Abandoned Mine Reclamation, selects projects based on essentially what is the most dangerous, like what are the emergencies, like the landslide that's about to destroy someone's home. And then what they'll do is they'll draw up that reclamation plan in-house. So they have engineers at the agency. They draw up the plan and then they bid it out through a contractor through a low bid process. And historically, these projects have been relatively small. The contracts over the past 3 years, the median contract size was about $390,000. And the average was about $1.6 million. And there's usually only a few of the contracts that are upwards of $1 million. And that's notable because in terms of the construction industry, that's small for Pennsylvania. The state prevailing minimum wage law does apply to these contracts, but historically, the Davis-Bacon law has not. Now that is changing, and I'm going to talk about that more in just a second. But mostly these are non-union contracts. We hope that changes, and there are things we can do to help that change. Though a few of them are union, including like Howard Concrete Pumping Solutions. They're a signatory employer that does some AML contracts, and they work with like the Operating Engineers Local 66 and multiple of the LIUNA locals in Pennsylvania and across the country. This gives you a sense of the distribution of these abandoned mine land features across the state. You can see there's kind of concentrations both in the Northeast and across the Southwest. And if we want these jobs cleaning up those sites, which as you can see are across the state, but I think in contrast to some of the other infrastructure programs have a heavy concentration in the rural parts of the states. If we want these to be good paying union jobs, there's a few things that we can do. And this, I want to note, is informed by a number of listening sessions with unions across the Ohio River Valley, including in Pennsylvania, and also union contractors in Pennsylvania. I'm happy to talk more about that in the questions if we want. But the first thing we can do is enforce the Davis-Bacon wage regulations. Like I said, this is brand new for the AML cleanup program. And we've heard from a lot of contractors that this is kind of a game changer. Like it significantly levels the playing field for the union contractors to compete with these for these contracts. But we need to make sure that it's enforced well. And that means we need an active monitoring program, and we need to make sure that the agencies are trained to enforce it well. We need the contracts to be larger because we've heard from union contractors and locals that, contracts of, $390,000, that's not going to catch the interest of most union contractors in Pennsylvania. So we need to prioritize projects that are larger in terms of their dollar value. And also we need to think about bundling multiple small projects of the same type into a single contract so that the dollar value is larger. And we have some examples of this in Pennsylvania and Indiana and other states. And then also we need to be thinking about, and Representative Kruger, hit this already, responsible bidder criteria. And I think one criteria that's important for this program is apprenticeship utilization. And that's because, with the massive kind of overnight increase in funding for this program, there are questions about how to ramp up the work rapidly. And that means, the need to both attract more contractors kind of immediately and grow this workforce, a skilled workforce over time. And, responsible bidder criteria that includes apprenticeship utilization could help do that over time. And it could send a signal also to the unions and these contractors to invest in, growing their apprenticeship training programs over time in areas where there are concentrations of abandoned mine lands. So I think that's another thing that's important. So yeah, I'll just end with flagging what I see as kind of some next steps here, which are first working with the federal government along the lines of the policies that I just mentioned in terms of how this needs to be implemented. And they've shown a lot of interest in making sure that these are good union jobs and doing that. Need to work with the Wolf administration and the implementing agencies. And it sounds like Representative Kruger, you're already convening conversations and coalitions along those lines. And finally, we need to actually be working with these unions and union contractors. And I think to a lesser extent, but also important, our local governments, to actually prepare for and bid on these contracts, because historically they haven't, for good reason, which I just touched on. But we want to make sure that they're aware and prepared to, get these contracts. So yeah, thanks for the opportunity to talk mine cleanup, and I'm happy to take any questions. Also, this was a labor-focused presentation, but if people want to get into climate or environmental or public health questions about the program, happy to talk about that as time allows.
Thank you, Eric. So I think we're going to hold questions and discussion to after my presentation. Who's sharing? Adrian, am I sharing my screen or are you sharing my PowerPoint? I'm
That is
fine.
totally up to you.
Let's see if I can share, because that gives me the control. It's not letting me currently, so you should.
All right, I've got it open already, so I can share it for you.
Okay. All right. So again, this is a second illustration of one of the pots of money in the infrastructure bill, and this is around broadband. And as you'll see going forward in the presentation, we're talking about this as the broadband solution. I mean, we've all been educated in the context of the pandemic. If we didn't know already, broadband is essential. It's basic infrastructure. It's as important as access to water and electricity in the interstate highway system and railroads were, if you go back 50 years, 100 years. Everybody across the state needs high quality, affordable broadband. Businesses need it, families need it, students need it, farmers need it, rural areas need it. If without quality, affordable, universal broadband, many rural places in Pennsylvania are at risk of spiraling down. They've lost population, they've struggled economically for 40 years. And if they don't have a quality of broadband that's equal to folks in suburban areas, equal to folks in urban areas, that's going to be a challenge in terms of those rural communities, the northern tier in Pennsylvania, around Altoona, in the middle of the T. So the whole state needs really high quality broadband. And as we'll see in a minute, right now, broadband in too much of Pennsylvania sucks, just to use a simple and straightforward phrase. This is broadband speeds, where you want to be up at 100. And we're looking at this map this is actually a 4-state map of upload speeds for broadband, but Pennsylvania is in the upper right of this. And you can see that the best shaded area is greater than 15, which is like, 6 or 7 times less than what I'm supposed to get in suburban Harrisburg from Verizon Fios. And then you look at other parts of the state and you're talking, less than 5 in a lot of the light blue areas of the state. And then the story on the next slide for download speeds is is no better. This is focused on, or is little better, is focused on Pennsylvania alone. So it's, again, shading counties. You know, we have some places, the 4 suburban counties outside Philly, Butler actually, and Beaver in the west that have greater than 50. But much of the state, again, is less than 15, and it's the rural areas that are particularly low in speed. So, you know, we ought to be able to put together bipartisan coalitions including business folks, economic development folks, for using the Infrastructure Act money to fix this problem. So let's take a look at what's in that bill. It's $65 billion for high-speed broadband. The biggest part of that, 2/3, roughly 42.5 billion, is going to be a formula-based distribution to the states. Roughly speaking, you know, the worse your internet connections are, the more money you're going to get. Most of the 2/3 of the other 20 plus $1 billion is actually a subsidy for low-income families that that could actually make up to 200% of the poverty line, make potentially, if we get it right, high quality broadband basically free for a lot of families in Pennsylvania. There's some smaller pots targeted at something called the Rural Utilities Services in the Federal Department of Agriculture, which is the successor agency to the New Deal Rural Electrification Administration, which, for those of you who know your history, the Rural Electrification Administration, actually headed initially by some proteges of Pennsylvania Governor Gifford Pinchot, played a pivotal role in bringing electricity and telephone to farms and rural areas from the mid-30s to the mid-50s. So the money there for the RUS can potentially reprise the role of that part of agriculture in bringing now, in this case, broadband to rural areas, to farms. And again, one of the formulas used in the 30s to 50s was to use co-ops because the existing providers of telephone and electricity then weren't always excited about serving everywhere, couldn't make enough money, profit rate that they wanted to make. So in the end, the Rural Electrification Administration was very pragmatic, even and did a fantastic job. And among other people, Senator Joe Manchin is a big fan of that history and actually the role of co-ops. And then there's some additional billions of dollars for equity planning. So on the next slide, you can begin to see what Pennsylvania's process is going to be. And so where there are opportunities to lean in to get the vision we want. And one link I should have put on here is ReImagine Appalachia, this 4-state campaign that Keystone Research Center helped start, which is a really aggressive climate action plan, get to net zero emissions by 2050, but targeting the states of Pennsylvania, West Virginia, Ohio, and Kentucky. It's an aggressive climate plan that leads with jobs and leads with the potential of, you know, bad news is we need to make massive investments to get to net zero carbon emissions by 2050. So it's going to cost a fair amount. But good news is we have to make massive amounts of investments because those investments can translate into good jobs, disproportionately trades jobs, also a fair number of manufacturing jobs. Again, the ReImagine Appalachia campaign had a study commission that estimated that its plan would create nearly 250,000 jobs a year in Pennsylvania alone. So some of those jobs are going to be in broadband. And again, those broadband jobs really underpin the transition to a sustainable economy more broadly, because really high quality broadband is critical to modernizing the grid. It's critical to sustainable transportation. It's critical to smart farming. So the process in Pennsylvania got started. Representative Pam Snyder from Greene County, Pennsylvania, was the chief sponsor of a bill that passed the legislature in December, establishing something called the Pennsylvania Broadband Development Authority. That authority, which is the entity which will oversee the management and distribution of the Infrastructure Act's broadband money, is searching for an executive director. The state is developing, I'm told it's in draft form, basically a strategic plan for broadband. The state will, I think it's in May, submit a letter of intent to access $5 million in upfront kind of infrastructure investment and jobs. That should be an A act for staffing, planning, and mapping. So that'll go to the Broadband Development Authority and used in developing the required 5-year state plan to the federal government, which will outline how the larger pot of Infrastructure Act money for broadband would be used. And then once that plan is approved, there'll be a state RFP, and there'll be a distribution of the funds. So that's sort of the mechanics of the process. And so here's the, the issue is, where can we lean in to get this money used well, and to deliver the benefits for Pennsylvania that we want. And really the critical early or the planning process place to intervene is around the state plan that will go to the feds. And so on the next slide, you can sort of see what ReImagine Appalachia and Keystone Research Center's priorities are in terms of influencing the use of the broadband money. The white paper that I'll put in the chat when I'm no longer presenting, but lays out a more comprehensive set of principles that should be used in distributing significant broadband money that was an aspiration when we published that white paper in 2020, but now is a reality. But the two kind of absolutely pivotal pieces or priorities are, the first thing is, we got to use this money to get the universal, high quality, accessible, affordable broadband for everybody. The history of broadband regulation and funding federally and in Pennsylvania is one in which the incumbent providers too often control the process, have outsized influence on regulations at the federal and state level. And so, historically, absolutely inadequate levels of broadband quality have been defined as broadband, and then you can't get some of the federal pots because you're already served by an existing provider. That's because those existing providers, want to make money for lousy service, money without having to make investments. So this money, which is enough money to do the job, we absolutely have to use it in Pennsylvania to get the quality, the accessibility, and the cost that we need. Second priority for Keystone and ReImagine Appalachia is this money needs to translate into good jobs, and that's part of that's good construction jobs. So it means, exactly like in the abandoned mineland reclamation area. It means making the state plan, making the state RFP strong in terms of labor standards. Obviously, it has to have federal prevailing wage laws as required by the federal statute, but as in the case of abandoned mine lands, there needs to be a conversation that includes unions, and we need to think through things like aggregating the money for broadband so that it's big enough to ensure that union contractors can bid on it. It's also true that in this day and age, unfortunately, whether it's federal or state prevailing wage law, there is endemic prevailing wage benefit fraud. So you can have prevailing wage laws on the books, but if it's the rule rather than the exception that non-union contractors don't pass on to the workers the full amount that they bill for in terms of the prevailing benefit, then you're still allowing those contractors to undercut contractors, including union contractors that are abiding by the law. So we need strong labor standards in the state plan. We need strong labor standards in the request for proposal. As I talked about earlier, this should be a bipartisan effort and a rural urban effort. There's no places that depend more on us using this money well than all of rural Pennsylvania. And then one thing we're excited about is when we approach issues in a multi-state way within the 4 states in the Ohio River Valley, Ohio, West Virginia, Kentucky, as well as Pennsylvania. There are great opportunities for peer learning. You can get together with your partners in other states, including our think tank partners, and you can learn more quickly because you're all trying to figure out what your respective state plan looks like and how to use this money well. And you're trying to figure out what's in the federal bill and trying to figure out the broadband provisions in particular in this case. So we're delighted to discover, based on early research, that Ohio under Republican Governor DeWine looks like a model. I mean, Ohio has already clarified that municipalities can compete for some new state money, which sets a pattern for their use of the infrastructure money. In Pennsylvania, municipalities can't deliver broadband currently. The biggest single recipient of some new state money in Ohio is the rural cooperative. And the person who heads their analog to the Pennsylvania Broadband Development Authority in Ohio is highly regarded as someone who's committed to their using investment, state and federal investment in broadband, to achieve the outcomes in terms of quality and cost and the boost to communities and quality of life that folks on this conversation all want. So we're really excited. We're going to put together an event in early, at some point in May, to talk further, and including with folks from the entire region. So stay tuned for that. I'm also going to put in the chat, there's an event coming up at Pitt on broadband, which we learned out about, Susan Kubreski learned about a couple of weeks ago. So I'm going to put the information on that in the chat in case anyone wants to get a head start in terms of more information on broadband and what the opportunities are. So with that, I'm going to stop, and I want to turn things to a discussion. I'm going to start by asking Representative Kruger, you're still here, right? Yeah, there you are. Okay, I want to ask you a couple of questions, and then I'm going to start looking in the chat to see what other questions are. Jeff has been reminding people that they should be ready to ask questions. So please join the conversation. But my first question for Representative Kruger is a couple of the tactics that people are talking about in terms of labor standards are that Pennsylvania has is, on the one hand, using the federal statute and the federal guidance. The Biden administration is friendly to strong labor standards and unions. The imposition of Davis-Bacon federal prevailing wage laws on all of this infrastructure money is one indication of that. And then a second strategy is in Pennsylvania is the Wolf administration's also supportive of strong labor standards. And so, as Eric laid out, we're following the kind of plan that Eric articulated. We are working with unions and contractors to influence, for example, the labor standards linked with the abandoned mineland money. But I'm wondering, as a leader of that bipartisan caucus, Representative Kruger, we know that the building trades famously have pretty good relationships with both sides of the aisle. I'm just wondering if you have any guidance in terms of, again, it's unclear to me at the moment how much different parts of the infrastructure package will or won't end up having a role for the legislature in terms of the details of the labor standards. But do you have any guidance in terms of how advocates might support the building trades in terms of getting more support from the Republican side of the aisle around labor standards?
That's a lot of questions, Steve. I think it's important for us to do as much as we can through the Wolf administration to bake things into how these grants will be implemented, because I do not have a lot of hope that if left to the legislature, we're going to get this right. And so things like, the fact that there's the project labor agreement standard for 35 million above, the fact that Davis-Bacon has been built into these projects will make it harder for the Republicans to divert the dollars away from the kind of contractors and the kind of workers that should be getting this work. But I sat through a hearing of the Environmental Resources and Energy Committee a couple of weeks ago, and they were talking about the abandoned mine land reclamation, and they were also talking about orphan well plugging. And it was clear to me that the majority chairman was going to try to do everything he could to make sure that money went to the contractors that they were using code words in the hearing to me, and that made it feel like they were going to try to block union contractors as much as possible. So we need the administration to do this directly. And so our asks have been things like, responsible contracting language wherever possible, to make sure that, as Eric really laid out pretty well, that the money is going to contractors who are going to do the work and hire the people they say they're going to hire. I'm still not clear whether that needs legislative authority. It's one of the questions we're researching right now. But I think we have a chance over the rest of the Wolf administration to really bake things in to how these dollars will be implemented in a way that hopefully it will be harder for a future governor, if they are not friendly to these issues, to dismantle easily. And I think that's the high priority right now.
Thank you, Leanne. I'm actually going to toss a question to Eric now, which is, he's been educating a lot of us at Keystone and in the ReImagine Coalition on the abandoned mineland issue. And one of the things he's been doing is, finding that actually that having strong labor standards or aggregating projects so that more union contractors are willing to bid on them, it's partly about translating this money into good union jobs, but there's actually a pretty strong business case. So Eric, tell us a little bit more about actually in terms of using this money well, getting the projects done well, what you're finding in from the literature on reclamation.
Sure. Well, I think I kind of have two responses to that. The first is about getting the jobs done, period, because there's such an increase in the amount of contracts. And the second is about getting them done efficiently and effectively. So on the first point, yeah, all of these state and tribal reclamation agencies are worried about finding the contractors, finding the workforce for such an increase in the amount of work that they need to do. And I think there's a really, really strong case to be made that, you know, in addition to increasing the union density of the sector through these provisions, they could actually help these agencies get the money out the door. And they could do that by attracting more contractors, essentially. You know, I mean, there is a slew of, you know, tend to be smaller contractors, not always, but tend to be smaller contractors that are already doing this work. And I think we'll continue to need, at least in the near term, their capacity to do the work. And they'll be subject to Davis-Bacon, et cetera, and responsible bidder requirements if we're able to get that. But if you could increase the contract size for, you know, if not all, many of these contracts, then you're going to attract a part of the construction sector that haven't even given AML contracts or mine cleanup contracts, you know, a second thought for a number of years. And that could really help just the program happen. The second thing is about making sure that the contracts are executed efficiently and you're saving as much time and cost as you can. And one thing that that I've been looking into is this question of bundling, which is pretty common in departments of transportation across the country. It's you know, the idea is that you take similar, it usually happens in like highway deployment or highway construction. You take a whole bunch of roads you want to build or bridges you want to build that are similar, and you bundle those projects together into groups and bid them out, you know, in individual contracts. And what a number of departments of transportations have found is that they save money doing this. That's why a lot of the agencies are attracted to it, because the agency has to spend less time actually administering and bidding these out, because there's, you know, fewer contracts per project. And the contractors actually save money because they can streamline, kind of economies of scale. They can streamline their processes in terms of building those roads or bridges. I looked at an example where this happened at the local level in Pennsylvania and also in Indiana. Indiana actually has gotten so advanced that they use machine learning to group their contracts together. Like they have this elaborate database and they're able to kind of churn out, oh, we should group these projects together in order to maximize our time and cost savings. You know, we may be years away from that. We are years away from that in terms of mine cleanup because the database isn't, you know, clean enough to have that kind of software utilization. But I definitely think that there's a cost and time savings case to be made. And hopefully it's not just in mine cleanup, but other agencies as they implement the bill as well. And I think there's things to learn as you go along. Like Indiana has found that they attract more bidders if the contract is larger, but only up to a point. So I think there's a case to be made for gathering data as we start this and monitoring it throughout, you know, the next few years. So we actually learn, not only in Pennsylvania, but, you know, across the country, how do we bundle mine reclamation projects in particular? Because it might be better for some, it might be better to bundle, for example, closing mine portals as opposed to some other project type. So I think that could be important too, in terms of implementation.
Thank you, Eric. So again, okay, I'm keeping my eye on the chat. If Jeff or Adrian notice a question from somebody in the audience, you should let me know. Does anyone, and if anyone wants to put their hand up, I can also take a question that way. But I'm not seeing any. I'm gonna go back to Leanne.
Hey, Steve,
Okay,
Steve?
yeah. ahead.
We got one question that came in through my DMs. I was going to drop it in the chat, but since I'm already off mute, I can also read it. They were wondering, and we can do this in a couple minutes and then kind of go into our closing. They were wondering, how do we go about making sure that these infrastructure projects are actually creating union jobs? Is there a way to make sure that these kinds of contracts only go to union workers?
So I'll take that. It's hard to do that. The policy tool that comes closer, closer to that is what's called a project labor agreement. So I'll put in the chat the ReImagine Appalachia white paper on community and labor standards. So there is in construction, ever since at least the construction of the Hoover Dam, on very big projects in the private sector, and on some public projects, if you have a project labor agreement, the details of those agreements vary, but the main thrust of those agreements is that they require getting all or most of the trades labor from the union hiring hall. So that's the best way to come close to what the questioner is asking. And those actually have been used recently. Most of the Ohio utility scale solar projects use project labor agreements. Most of the, or all of the West Virginia wind projects in the last 10 years use project labor agreements. And again, these along in line with the idea that yes, this is good for unions, good for union workers, but that is also good for the quality of construction. It's good for on time, on budget delivery. Project labor agreements are used in the private sector. So they're used, for example, in the Pittsburgh region, UPMC, when it's doing billion-dollar hospital construction projects. I mean, if anyone who knows about the leadership of UPMC knows that they aren't doing anything except to get the best possible deal for themselves, because that's how UPMC operates. And they always use PLAs, and they keep using PLAs because the trades in southwestern Pennsylvania are really high quality. They actually, in southwestern Pennsylvania, the trades do 96% of the apprenticeship training in the last 20 years, including 96% of the apprenticeship training of Hispanics and male minorities or male people of color, and including 98% of the women apprentices in southwestern Pennsylvania. So PLAs are the strongest tool. They get challenged sometimes in courts, which is why Eric talked about responsible contractor provisions. You know, if you require that contractors all have the appropriate licenses, if they all have to have a registered apprenticeship program, if they all have to not have violations of labor or other laws, that's another way to level the playing field and ensure that union contractors get a fair share or a substantial share of the business. Okay. So by my calculations, Jeff and Adrian, we got 10 more minutes left, or we got 5 minutes left? Going back to the, okay, I think I think we got a few more minutes left. Jeff, I know at one point you wanted to say a little bit more about what some of the other sessions in the previous weeks of
Yeah, we'll do that after we wrap up, Steve. Just leave
All right.
about 3 minutes at the end. We're trying to end at 2:15, so I'll do that just as we wrap up.
All right, so I got another 7 minutes. Okay, so I'm going to come back to, again, if there's any other questions in the chat, people should let me know. So I'm going to go back to Leanne and take her down memory lane. Go back more than 7 years when she used to head something called the Sustainable Business Network in Philadelphia. And one of the things that entity did was actually a workforce initiative connected with what's called green infrastructure. What green infrastructure used in the context of water and sewer systems is it's kind of a soft, low-tech way of stopping, among other things, overflow of sewer systems, some older sewer systems, when it rains a lot. And so if you have rain gardens and you have pervious surfaces, there's a lot of low-tech ways of absorbing water before it goes into the combined water sewer system. Anyway, one of the challenges as this has emerged as an alternative to very capital intensive so-called gray infrastructure is again navigating the labor enviro division. So yeah, I don't know whether you've looked hard at the water and sewer money in the Infrastructure Act, whether what are there opportunities for Pennsylvania to explore blue-green wins in terms of the use of the water and sewer money?
Sure. So Steve and I actually worked on this together back in 2008. The last time there was a big federal Jobs Act under a previous administration. And we looked at industry opportunities and wound up focusing on green stormwater infrastructure, mainly because the city of Philadelphia at the time was planning for an overhaul of how they handled the water systems. There was a Green Cities Clean Waters report that came out that committed a lot of public money to green infrastructure. And again, this is over a decade ago. And so we felt like if we could connect the dots of public money and contractors and workers, that maybe we could get a triple bottom line impact of good impacts for people and the environment, as well as good use of public funds. And it worked. The Sustainable Business Network of Greater Philadelphia actually has done some recent economic impact analysis and jobs reports. So if you're not familiar with the Sustainable Business Network of Greater Philadelphia, it still exists. They're still doing work in this space and they're worth checking out. And I have to say, Steve, this moment feels like that moment did, where there was a lot of federal money moving. There was public policy that was receptive to the industries that we cared about. And again, I feel like we're in a space of connecting the dots again. Now, stormwater infrastructure projects could create a lot of jobs for the laborers. They're the folks on the ground, digging trenches. They're sort of the first line manual labor on construction projects, and then they're followed by the operating engineers. And in my conversations with laborers, they don't really have a preference for what kind of project they're putting in. It's just a matter of how many man hours there are, because at the end of the day, the leadership of labor unions are measured with how they're keeping their members working, and they run for re-election every so often in the same way that we run for re-election. And so keeping their members working is their top priority. And often it doesn't matter what the work is, as long as it's real. And one of the things that I found, those of us who come out of the sustainability movement have talked for a long time about our vision for things, but those plans were often at the size of white papers and not necessarily shovel-ready projects. And so when at the end of the day, you need someone who needs a paycheck next week, the best white paper in the world with the most amazing sustainability visions not going to feed a family. And so I think there's a lot of impetus from those on the green side of the equation to be a little more pragmatic about the things that we're looking at, and also to be more sensitive about the language that we're using. I've seen conversations break down between groups because folks didn't really think about the terminology that they were using. So for example, in Philadelphia, when there was a fire at the refinery, and there were some environmentalists who were celebrating the shutdown of that refinery, which, yes, had created hazardous air conditions for low-income people in the neighborhood forever. They forgot that there were men and women who literally lost their jobs that day and ran towards an explosion and actually prevented a much larger disaster by putting their lives on the line. And I think no matter which perspective we come from, putting ourselves in the shoes of someone else and being empathetic and being conscious of the language that we are using, and not using terms that are triggering for the other side, especially not intentionally triggering, is part of how we move forward in this work. So that's been one of my biggest learnings and something I felt like I needed to share before we ended.
Thank you, Leanne. That's inspiring stuff. Eric, do you have any final comments?
Sure. Regarding what you were saying about project labor agreements, I just wanted to flag that in Illinois, there's a state law that requires project labor agreements for public construction projects. And so there, the union density among the mine cleanup sector is much higher, basically, than in the rest of the country, as a function of that and other policies. So I think it's important to like keep that in perspective, and to continue to look towards something like a strong tool like a project labor agreement for mine cleanup and other projects where we can get it. I hadn't mentioned it because, as you noted, Steve, from conversations with unions and union contractors in the state, there's just hesitancy because of these lawsuits around them. And so it's like, we're trying to think creatively about how do we level the playing field and get these contracts in the hands of union contractors, if we have to, if we can't use that. And yeah, I'll just close by saying, I think that the mine cleanup program is such an incredible opportunity to demonstrate that we can create good union paying jobs, cleaning up land, air, and water across the Commonwealth. And so I would just encourage people to learn more about the program, plug in where you can and where it makes sense. These sites are all across the state, because I think if we can succeed in the implementation of this program, and to your point, Representative Kruger, actually have these projects reclaimed by union workers all across the state, the impact will be much larger than just this program. The coalitions and trusts we'll build, I think, will have a lot of spillover effects in a great way. So I hope we can get there and look forward to working with you all.
Thank you so much, Eric. Thank you so much, Representative Kruger. I'm putting in the chat my contact information and the website of ReImagine Appalachia. Anybody who wants to, put their oar in or bring themselves or their networks to winning the win on the infrastructure plan or engaging in other ways with the ReImagine Appalachia campaign, on the website, you can navigate yourself to a form where you can express an interest in helping and also get yourself on the list for the ReImagine newsletter. With that, I'm going to turn things over to the Master of Ceremonies for the entire budget summit, Jeff Garris.
Hey, thank you so much, Steve. Thank you again to Representative Kruger. Thank you to Mr. Dixon. Thank you also to Steve Herzenberg for putting this together and for bringing his expertise to this. We really appreciate this. I want to let folks know that this session, the recording of it and resources from it will be available on the PA Budget and Policy Center website. in the next day or so. You can go there and find recordings of all of the 6 workshops that we've been doing over the last 3 weeks. Our opening sessions as well, with a keynote speech from Senator Vincent Hughes, and of course our budget analysis from that opening day. But we are heading now into the final session of our budget summit. It's our closing plenary session. We're really excited about it. It's a legislative panel discussion with a number of champions for working people in the General Assembly of Pennsylvania coming to us from the State House of Representatives. We're really looking forward to that. We're so excited to have Corinna Wilson returning and bringing her expertise and her experience to the role of moderator for this. There's going to be opportunities for folks to submit questions to any of those panelists. That starts at 2:30, so we're only about 15 minutes away. You might want to stay logged into the Zoom events, join us there at the lobby, and then enter the closing plenary session at 2:30 for the 1-hour discussion that we're going to have with these legislators. Again, thanks so much to all of you for making the time to join us. Thank you for making this a priority. Thank you for all the work you do. Thank you to our colleagues from PVPC who've been working diligently behind the scenes. Quick shout out especially to Adrian Stanley, our digital comms person, who's had to do a tremendous amount of work to get this together. So thank you to Adrian. Thank you to Stephanie Frank. Thank you to the rest of the PVPC team. Have a great afternoon. We'll see you in a few minutes, everybody. Take care.